Annie, put that stick down.
You shout, standing in the doorway to your house. You watch as your little raven-haired child takes a stick twice his size off the ground and pummels it against a nearby tree, screeching so loudly it might make your ears bleed. You sigh and put your hands over your ears, trying to drown out the sound. It was probably a very good thing he was too young to understand what the Force was, because if he knew how to use it, he probably would have killed someone by now.
I got him.
Ladson calls out, scooping Anakin up from behind. He struggles and kicks, but Ladson holds firm, trying to wrestle the branch out of his grip. You walk up to them from behind, putting your arm over Ladson's shoulder as you place your palm flat up against the top of your child's head.
Sleep, Annie.
You command with as much of the force as you can muster, and his body goes limp in Ladson's arms, the stick falling lifelessly to the ground.
You gotta teach me how to do that.
Ladson huffs. He gently positions Annie over one shoulder as he carries him inside.
Kid is strong for a 5-year-old. Yeah, well,
You sigh as you watch Ladson tuck him into his bed.
he has the Force and his father's temper. Makes sense he'd be at least a little out of control.
You can see Ladson's shoulders stiffen as he turns and looks up at you, his eyes full of concern. He doesn't need to ask if you're okay. He knows your answer by now.
He'll come back.
You tell him, even if you're not quite sure you believe it yourself. Kylo Ren had only returned a handful of times since he had last named Anakin and slipped off into the night. The first time he had returned was a few months after the first, when you had returned from teaching your self-defense classes with Annie and Ladson to find a small group of stormtroopers outside your door and Kylo Ren sitting shirtless on your bed, waiting for you to return. You had taken him quickly, eagerly, determined to feel as much of him as you could before he departed again. He had stayed for only 2 days that time, relieving Ladson, who stayed with Sadie, so that he could have alone time with just you and his son. Annie hadn't been able to talk by that point yet, but you had still taught him to sign in order to communicate his basic needs, and it was then that you taught him the Tortu Rune sign for father, thumb pressed against his forehead. Of course, his motor skills weren't as sharp as they could be yet, and he almost poked himself in the eye, but it was cute nonetheless. That first time had been strange, seeing Kylo interact with his son as a father properly should, holding him in one arm and talking to him without any hint of awkwardness, as if a secret part of him liked this happy accident you had created with him. You were content to remain wrapped up in his other arm, lips pressed against his warm skin, as you trailed a series of kisses up and down his arm, determined to try to impress this memory upon your conscience so that you could never lose it. Kylo still told you that he loved you before he left, and he proved it the only way he could, by coming to visit you as often as he could, even though the time between visits was long and lonely, and none of them lasted longer than 3 days. The last time he had arrived, Annie was a bit older, enough to recognize faces and babble coherent words, but not old enough to commit the scene to memory as he sat on Kylo's knee and called him Daddy. You watched Kylo's reaction carefully, then, pleased to see the corner of his lip quirk up in the semblance of a smirk as he appraised this peculiar young thing that he had created with you. He had stayed for an entire week that time, and you almost let yourself believe that he would never leave until one of his stormtroopers knocked on the door and said that something urgent had happened and that they had to be getting back. He had kissed you quickly and looked you in the eyes as he told you he loved you, holding your chin between the fingers of his gloved hands before he stalked off into the dead of night, his cape snapping in the breeze as it floated out behind him. He hadn't returned since. You tried not to think about why he never returned. At least the stormtrooper's announcement helped cement the notion that it wasn't because of you, that you hadn't done anything wrong, although in the dead of night, when you were alone in the bed, the idea couldn't help but rear its ugly head from the depths of your conscience. But no, you knew Kylo hadn't left because of you or your child, even though you couldn't figure out why he never returned. Was it because he was busy with whatever militaristic operations the First Order was planning? Was it because it was simply too dangerous, and he felt that his visit might only endanger your safety? Was it some combination of the two? Puzzling over the reasons as to why he wasn't here exhausted you, and so you tried to distract yourself from it however you could, even going so far as to avoid saying his name if you could help it. You referred to him simply as Annie's father, or him, and left it at that. Ladson had certainly stepped up to take the role of Annie's father figure in Kylo's absence, but it didn't help much. Anakin knew implicitly that Ladson was not his father, perhaps clinging on to some memory that his young brain had somehow preserved. Even still, you, Sadie, and Ladson banded together to do the best you could to raise him right. Ladson took Anakin with you to your self-defense classes, standing with him off to one side, while Anakin struggled to follow along with you, thrusting his tiny limbs out in all directions until gravity got the better of him. It was cute, and everyone in the class liked watching him, at least until Anakin started to cry loud, fitful sobs that racked his whole body. At that point, Ladson was always quick to grab him and carry him outside so as not to disturb the rest of the class. Even though Sadie had tried to teach you time and time again, you were still a pretty lousy cook, truth be told. And so Sadie took over that responsibility, coming over every night to cook meals for the four of you. It was nice eating dinner together like a quaint little family, and it helped alleviate your thoughts of Kylo, at least temporarily. In fact, Sadie always seemed to be around, serving some function or another. You had tried teaching Anakin how to speak and write BASIC, and how to sign Tortura Rune, just for starters, but he wasn't taking to it as quickly as you would have liked, and you were quickly getting frustrated with his lack of progress. Apparently, he was not as quick to acquire new languages as you were, but fortunately Sadie was more patient, and took on the role of his linguistics teacher as well. Annie actually seemed to be learning faster under her charge, or enjoying it more at any rate, and you couldn't help but concede that Sadie was probably just a better teacher than you were. Between that, her almost constant presence in your kitchen, and the fact that she still sewed clothes for you four to wear, it seemed that she had the maternal thing down perfectly, much better than you did at any rate. The hard truth was that you weren't quite sure what your role was when it came to Anakin. You didn't want to be the sole disciplinarian, and yet it always seemed to come down to you. If Sadie made him a scrap of clothing that didn't fit him properly, or was in a color he didn't particularly care for that day, he would start screaming and crying, knocking over and destroying everything around him like a mini dust storm. At first, you had tried to reason with him, tried to get him to sit down and talk about how he was feeling. But after he had swung his fist at Ladson and kicked Sadie in the shin, you supposed it was just easier to pacify him using the Force until he woke up in a better mood. It probably wasn't the best of approaches, but you didn't know what else you were supposed to do. You had been able to calm Kylo simply with your presence and through the power of the bond you shared with him, but there was no such hope with taming Annie. Sometimes you considered yourself a horrible parent, but then again, you weren't sure if you really had ever even wanted to be a parent. It just sort of happened. And you should have known that was a risk for having all that sex with Kylo, but at the time you had assumed that the birth control regulator implant in your thigh had been working properly. You didn't think there was actually any risk involved. It simply hadn't occurred to you that it would fail. Glitches happened, of course, but you weren't completely sure whether it simply malfunctioned, or if it had been the Force at work, disabling it so that you could conceive Kylo Ren's child before he sent you off. The real truth was that you didn't know what the heck you were supposed to do as a parent. Your mother had died when you were very young, and you didn't remember her. And your father had been drunk most of the time, and sold you into servitude when you were 12 in exchange for Ebla. You had used your linguistic wits to survive on your own after your father had given you a cruel shove into the dangers of the galaxy, but you knew you could not do the same to Annie. You had turned out fine, or at least as close to fine as one could be given your circumstances, but Annie was not like you. He was Kylo Ren's son, and that brought on a whole new host of unnecessary dangers that you didn't quite know how to deal with. Regardless, you were going to have to do your best, at least until Kylo decided to come back to fetch him and begin his Force training. Still, it wasn't like caring for Annie was a completely intolerable affair. He may have had his father's temper tantrums and violent swings of mood, but there were times when he seemed, for all intents and purposes, like a normal, innocent child. going on walks with Ladson to the market, and picking up wildflowers to make a wreath to put in your hair. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he would come wake you up and sit on the end of your bed while you told him stories of your adventures aboard the Starkiller base and elsewhere in the galaxy, making sure to filter the content to fit a 5-year-old's sensitive ears. Other times, he would wake you up in the middle of a rainstorm, and you would grab Ladson's hand and pull him out into the rain with you as you all ran around in the dark, jumping in puddles and splashing each other until the 3 of you became horribly sick and Sadie had to double her maternal efforts to take care of the lot of you. But sometimes you couldn't help but think it would be easier if he wasn't around. He was a constant living, breathing reminder that Kylo had just abandoned you here, and during the nights when you were alone in your bed, you couldn't help but think that Kylo was never coming back for you. It had been years since he last came to visit you, and he knew where you were. You hadn't gone anywhere. He knew right where to find you. There was always the possibility that he had been struck down in battle, but you knew that wasn't the case either. You would sense it if Kylo was no longer on this mortal plane, somehow. You just knew that you would feel your connection being severed, as if a star had suddenly been swiped out of the sky. It didn't help that Annie, being a child, couldn't help but remind you of this fact every now and again. Sometimes he would sit at the dinner table and refuse to eat until you would tell him stories of his father. Sometimes he would ask when Kylo was coming home all day and all night and into the next morning. You knew it wasn't his fault. It was the expectation of every child to be loved and adored by his or her parents, and you couldn't help but feel that sometimes Anakin was acting out in the hopes that his father might eventually come, negative attention trumping abandonment. And so you did what you could to try to be enough on your own.
Come at me again, Annie,
you tell him, sitting outside on the grass. Ladson was sitting at the base of a tree, looking on, while Sadie sat on your doorstep and sewed. She had gotten a shipment of Merly wool in a few weeks prior, but had waited until now to try sewing with it to let the stink wear out. Merly wool was extremely warm during the cold season and resisted rain quite well, but it stank something awful if you didn't air it out properly. Anakin ran toward you, massive stick in his hands as he tried to hit you over the head with it. You just casually lifted one hand in the air and used the force to lift your staff to block it, creating a horizontal barrier just above your forehead.
That's not fair,
Annie pounced, lowering his stick.
No fair you can use the force. You'll be able to use the force one day.
You tell him.
When you're older, you just gotta be patient.
He lowers his head and throws the stick away from him, watching it bounce lengthwise along the ground.
Hey, it's not just about waiting. To use the force, you have to be physically strong, too. So we're training you, preparing you, so when it's time to train you in the force, you can kick all sorts of butt.
Usually, that wasn't enough encouragement to get him to eagerly run over and pick up his stick. But not today.
But when is Dad coming back? When he can.
You tell him patiently.
Your dad's a very powerful guy. Super strong, very brave, and there's a lot of people counting on him. He's fighting a war up there in the stars, and when it's all said and done, he's going to come home and he's going to train you to be as big and as powerful as he is. How do you know?
He asks softly, and you get up and scoot a little closer to him, taking both of his tiny hands in yours.
Because when you were only a tiny little thing, your dad came to visit you. And when he saw you, it was like the world just stopped. And he offered you his hand, and you squeezed his finger. And do you remember what he said? He said, "Ouch!"
And he says with a playful yelp, reciting his part in this familiar story perfectly.
That's right.
You tell him, brushing his hair off his forehead with one hand.
He said, "Ouch! That's my tough little guy. He's going to be big and strong one day. He's going to be as brave as his daddy and as tough as his mommy." Mommy's not so tough.
Annie says with a childish giggle, and your eyes spark.
Mommy's not so tough?
You ask, grabbing him with both hands as you tickle his stomach.
Mommy's not so tough?
He collapses on the ground in a fit of giggles as you tickle his stomach, watching him roll in the grass beneath you as he emits shrieks of childish laughter.
Help!
Anakin giggles, twisting his neck up and to the side to look at Ladson.
Help?
Ladson asks, getting to his feet.
I don't know. You've seen her. She's going to beat me.
Nevertheless, Ladson puts both hands firmly on your shoulders as you sit up, and Annie quickly scampers over to the tree to watch the ensuing fight. He loved it when you sparred with Ladson. He absolutely couldn't get enough of it. You weren't quite sure why he loved it as much as he did, until you remembered that he had probably inherited your fighting spirit. As much as his physical looks and temper tantrums insinuated that he was Kylo Ren's child, he was also half your child, which meant that he had probably inherited your strongest qualities, like your fighting spirit, your stubbornness, and probably your indomitable sense of self-reliance. You could only hope that he inherited that last one anyway. Ladson helps you get to your feet, and you take a few steps back from each other, both squatting down into a fighting position, knees bent, one leg thrust up behind you, as you raise your fist to the level of your chest.
You ready to do this?
Ladson asks.
Born ready.
You reply simply. Knowing that he's never one to attack first, you lunge toward him, planting a kick into his side without your foot making contact. He lifts his right leg into the air as he tries to kick you back, but you just dart away from him, circling him playfully. Ladson throws another kick out in your direction, but he's not close enough to make contact, and so you use the opportunity while he's off balance to jump to one side, placing two kicks in the air, one at his chest and the other at his head, still without making contact. You land deftly and spin around, throwing your leg out in another high kick behind you as you spin. Anakin jumps and cheers for you from his spot on the sidelines, and you turn to him and do the faintest of bows.
Yeah.
Ladson says playfully, and you can feel the top of his foot strike your abdomen as he hits your side.
Ow.
You say teasingly as you stand back up and whirl around to face him.
No fair. I wasn't paying attention. Never turn your back on your opponent, Annie.
Ladson calls to him before turning back to you and lowering his voice.
Seriously, what are you teaching this kid? Oh, please.
You say, raising your voice in mock offense as you strike a punch toward his face. He cranes his neck to the side, dodging it easily, and it's all you can do to block a punch that comes in at your side. You twist your body around to place a strike from your elbow against his side, but he uses this position to push the back of your body flush against his right arm around your neck with his hand on your left shoulder.
Go ahead and do it,
he whispers in your ear.
You know he loves it. Fine.
You grab his arm with both hands, tighten your core, and scoot down and back, flipping Ladson over your shoulder and onto the ground in front of you.
Yay!
Annie cheers as he rushes over to you, putting both hands on Ladson's chest.
Mommy wins! Mommy always wins.
Sadie says as she stands up and walks over to you.
'Cause Mommy's the best.
You say teasingly, sending a wink in her direction as you smirk at her. She rolls her eyes, and you appreciate how much you can have entire conversations with her with just your eyes alone.
Hey Sadie, remember when you attacked me in Hux's room and I flipped you over my shoulder like that? How could I forget? It's late,
Sadie says.
I should be getting back. Tell your father I said hey.
You tell her, pulling her into a quick one-armed hug.
And thank him for the house again. Seriously?
Sadie asks, putting one hand on her hip.
Do you know how long it's been? You don't have to keep thanking him for that.
You put one arm behind Anakin's back, urging him closer to you.
But we thank people who do nice things for us without getting anything in return. Don't we, Annie? Thank you,
Annie says as he looks up at her, mostly out of learned behavior instead of any true comprehension of your words.
I'll tell him.
Sadie sighs as she shakes her head.
Again. Night all. Night.
Ladson echoes as he turns to head back inside with you. You tuck Annie into bed, who thankfully goes to sleep without any sort of a fuss. You were never asleep as soon as your head hit the pillow, not once, so it was a trait he must have learned from his father, if such traits could be passed on through genetics alone. Ladson stands behind you as you stare down at him, his hand stroking your upper arms in a comforting gesture.
This isn't so bad, is it?
he asks.
It's not so bad.
You tell him quietly.
I really do miss him, though. I know.
He responds softly.
But you're safe here. He's safe here. Isn't being here 100 times better than being on the Starkiller base? I guess.
You shrug. When you closed your eyes, you could still picture Kylo's room, where you had spent so many of your days. If you closed your eyes and focused hard enough, you could still picture yourself walking through his apartment, past the kitchen, past the living room, past Kylo's secret room where he vented his anger to the window, where, looking out, you could still see the blistering snow and the white icy mountain peaks in the distance. You didn't know that was all gone now. You didn't know that the planet had been ultimately destroyed in a resistance attack. You didn't know that at least a part of the reason why Kylo had never come back to visit you again. You didn't know anything. You had stayed at your academia at the far end of the galaxy, living your life so far removed from the skirmish between the First Order and the Resistance that you had little idea what transpired in your absence. Not that you cared either way. War was still war to you, and you didn't believe either side was in the right or wrong. Everything existed in shades of gray. Everything, even Kylo Ren, supposedly the most wicked man in the galaxy that still had a soft spot when it came to you and his son. He had proven to you at least twice that he could love selflessly, both when he saved your sister and when he sent you away for your own safety. Although that first one could be argued, there was no denying the last one. He cared about your life and he wanted you to be safe, even if it meant that you could no longer spend every night with him. But as you laid in bed that night, you didn't care about being safe. You wanted him to be here with you, or for you to be with him, wherever he was in the galaxy. You didn't care if you were sleeping in trenches with blaster bolts flying overhead. You wanted to be near him. You trusted that he would come back for you, but it was hard to have unremitting confidence in a shadow that seemed to sulk at the very edge of your memory. You still had a scarf to cling on to at night, but there were times such as tonight when it almost seemed like an insult, like it was simply mocking your unwavering devotion to him.
Please come back.
You whispered to the darkness of your room.
I don't want to stay here anymore.
You would have laughed at the timing if it had been something you read in one of Sadie's silly little romantic stories, for the timing was far too perfect to be realistic. Even still, you couldn't have chalked it up solely to coincidence if you wanted to. Kylo had trained you how to use the Force, but there were still subtle impressions of the Force that you were able to perceive without being consciously aware of them. You simply chalked it up to having a stellar intuition, not really knowing that there was anything more to it. Therefore, it wasn't all that impossible to believe that as soon as these words passed your lips, an unknown ship entered your planet's atmosphere. The pilot had been given an order, and his goal was simple: find Kylo Ren's child and his mother.